Welcome, listeners, to another episode of Beyond the Taj, the podcast in which we discuss the richness, complexity, and diversity of the Indian Muslim experience, from the distant past to the here and now. I'm your host, Safa Ahmed, and in today's episode, we're taking a dive into the lives of two historic Indian Muslim queens. Journalist and writer Tom Verde recently published the book Queens of Islam, The Muslim World's Historic Women Rulers, with Olive Branch Press. As per the blurb, Queens of Islam examines the lives of 15 of the most remarkable female leaders of Muslim dynasties, empires, and caliphates, from Islam's earliest centuries through the end of the 17th century. Their stories demonstrate that through the faith's long history, there were many women who achieved positions of power and served as effective rulers, revered by those they governed while being respected, even feared, by their contemporary world leaders. Two of those women carved out their place in the crowded landscape of Indian history, in the Delhi Sultanate and in the Mughal Empire. You've probably heard of both of them: Razia Sultan, the only female queen of the Delhi Sultanate, who broke the rules of pardah, who defied the will of an established elite to cater to the people, and Nur Jahan, a patron of the arts, a visionary of fashion and architecture, and a talented politician. Who were these women, and what can we learn from their stories? We're here with Tom Verde to take a closer look into both these women's lives. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So this book covers 15 Muslim queens across the centuries, from Iraq to Persia, Indonesia to Nigeria. Out of this list, two of them were Indian Muslim queens. Why did you feel it was important to include Razia Sultan and Nur Jahan and highlight their impact for audiences across the world?
Aside from the fact, and it's a big aside, that they were both very impressive people, both very powerful women, who really deserve attention and more attention, outside of India. I think it's important that more people know about them. But also, the empires that they ruled were enormous and very influential, very powerful. Both the Sultanate of Delhi and the Mughal Empire were significant political states in India and in the Muslim world. So that's why I chose to include them both.
So let's start out by going deeper into the lives of the first of these two women chronologically, Razia Sultan. Can you walk us through who she was and how she came to power and what odds she overcame to get there?
Yeah, well, Razia was kind of handpicked by her father, the Sultan Iltutmish, who was the third, actually the third Sultan of the Sultanate of Delhi, the first to rule in Delhi, and he looked around at what he had built. He was a remarkable guy. He was a slave, a Mamluk slave, who came from Central Asia, and he built a tremendous empire that was cultured, wealthy. He spent a lot of time in the saddle, expanding the empire's borders all the way from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal. And he was also a very religious man, very pious, and he valued education and the arts and culture. And so he built an empire that was very impressive. And unfortunately, his sons were either incompetent or just idiots. I mean, they just were not able to inherit. He just didn't trust that they were going to be able to maintain this empire that he built. But his daughter, Razia, he recognized early on was very capable. When he was off on campaign, he left her in charge of his city, and she managed things very well. Upon his return, everything was great. There were no problems. And so, towards the end of his life, he actually had his ministers draw up a document that said, "I choose my daughter to succeed me." And everybody said, "Okay, all right, kind of." I mean, some of them were not accepting of this, others were. And unfortunately, even upon his death, even though they had this document, her brother, Firuz, just kind of shoved her aside and took over. Now, he was a very, a very unfortunate choice to be for a sultan. He was a uh, kind of a partier. I mean, that's what he was. He was a he drank. He went through the looted the treasury. He had no gift for governing whatsoever. He was just totally self indulgent, and he had a you know a lot of these stories are really right out of Grimm's fairy tales. I mean, there's a wicked stepmother. Razia had a wicked stepmother. uh, Firuz's mother. Firuz was her half brother, and she kind of worked behind the scenes to make sure that he succeeded by influencing the local nobles, a group of a kind of a core group called the Chahalgani, which means the 40, but the 40 isn't actually, it really just meant a group. It wasn't exactly 40 people. But in any event, she worked that group of elites to have them support her son. But they quickly realized that that they made a bad choice by accepting her influence because she immediately started to knock people off right and left, people that offended her, other women in the harem that she had resentments against. Meanwhile, her son was just off doing, drinking all day. And so they realized they made a big mistake. And Razia was really the right choice for the job. And so they welcomed her to accept the throne, which she did, and she made a kind of a she built a case for herself and stood before them and said, "Hey, look what you have before me, right? It's a disaster, and if you will just give me a chance, I think you'll see that I will do a good job." And the one very interesting thing that she said in this presentation was, "Look, if I don't do a good job, you can fire me essentially, right?" Which is really rare for a medieval monarch to voluntarily say, "All right, I'll step down." Um, so that's how she came to power. She was exceptionally gifted. Her father handpicked her, and she ultimately proved that she was the right person for the job.
Speaking of proving to be the right person for the job, not no distinction there, whether she was a man or a woman, you highlight in the book that certain right-wing Muslim elements, especially in the modern age, tend to claim that Islamic jurisprudence forbids a woman's rule. But in Razia's time in Delhi, as you pointed out, there was a hub for Muslim scholarship, and her father was also noted as a man of respectable religious character. Was there any opposition on religious grounds at the time to Razia being declared her father's heir and ruling independently?
Yeah, that's a good question. In her case, as well as in the cases of other Muslim women rulers in the book, there really isn't. They couldn't find any legal objection. They when she was proposed as Iltutmish's successor, they kind of flipped through the book and said, "All right, hang on, wait a minute. Well, we got nothing," and so and then some of them actually said, "No, look, I mean, there's if you'll permit me to quote, this is from a court historian from a century later, but he was, kind of summarizing what happened. And he said that many a woman has fared as vanquisher of men in battle. Many a man has owed his position to a woman. So if this daughter of the king were raised to the throne in this capital, she would prove better than the sons of kings." And that's basically what Iltutmish had said upon his deathbed. And something to realize uh, is that Iltutmish came from, as I say, Central Asia. He came from a culture that had for centuries accepted women as political leaders, as business leaders, military leaders. Because that part of the world, the Central Asian steppes, was a nomadic or semi-nomadic tribal culture. And you have a semi-nomadic tribal culture. You have people on the move a lot. You got to move stuff because you follow the seasons and you follow resources and you can't afford to have half the population just kind of sitting around, right? Doing nothing, being waited on. It just wouldn't work. So women in that culture fought alongside men. They ruled at times, and as I say, they were business people. They ran their own businesses. So this was not unfamiliar to the people of, by that time, the people of northern India. Um, and so that helped, establish her legitimacy. And you see this again and again in many of the women in the book, because in the Muslim world, soon after it spread from the Arabian Peninsula, the Arabs decided, well, look, we can't run this whole thing ourselves, right? I mean, it was just too unwieldy, and they adopted the ways of the Byzantines and of the Persians, and so they co-opted people to help them run the empire. And a lot of these people were also, some of them started out as slaves. Iltutmish was a slave. It's not a slave like a Southern American slave. You can't think of it that way. They were kidnapped, if you will, not kidnapped, but they were abducted, and then raised in in the culture. But a lot of them ascended to positions. Well, Iltutmish became the Sultan, right? I mean, and a lot of them were military leaders, advisors, and uh, so it was just a way of adapting different cultures to succeed. And so part of that was this acceptance of women in positions of authority. It wasn't something unusual. Now there has been, some people often point to a hadith, which is a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, that said, it, I'm paraphrasing, no country will succeed if a woman's in charge. Now, the hadith are very, it's a questionable hadith. The hadith, as you probably know, you trace it back. So and so said this to so and so to so and so, and you kind of go all the way back as far as you can to establish legitimacy. And I believe that the legitimacy of this hadith has been, called into question. It's sort of a convenient way for men, usually, to say, "Well, no, we're not gonna accept this." But the pushback from the Chahalgani, from this elite core of, they were kind of military leaders, was mostly because she threatened their power. That's really it. I mean, that's the way it works in politics, whether you're a man or a woman. You know, if your power is threatened, then you get prickly and you figure you're going to do something about it. And they ultimately did. They spread rumors about her, unjust rumors. Usually, what do men often do, right? Oh, they sex shame, right? They slut shame. That's what they did with her. They said, well, she's got this equerry, like the Amir of the horses, the guy who assisted her, and they said that she was having an affair with him, and she was unmarried, and it was a big scandal, which was never proven, and so it was just a way of kind of getting her out of the way.
Razia's story, as you've highlighted, there's so much resistance initially to bring her into power, but we remember her today as this woman whose story is really bookended and really bolstered by looking at the reigns of her two very incompetent brothers. So I want to ask you now, to dive more into the specifics of what characterized Razia Sultan's rule and what made her so beloved in ways that her brothers were not.
Mm. Well, she carried on many traditions that her father established, and one of them was justice. He had a policy where if you felt that you needed justice or you were being persecuted for some reason, you could go to the Sultan, and you could go to the palace door and ring this bell, and it meant that you would have an audience with the Sultan. Or if you felt that you wanted the Sultan's attention, most Indians at that point were wearing white garments or very plain garments, and if you wanted the Sultan's attention, you would put on a brightly colored garment, red usually. And so, uh, and when Razia was trying to make her case to the people of Delhi, this is what she did. She put on a red garment and stood up on on the portico of the palace, which overlooked the mosque, and started to talk to the people. Now, the people loved her because of that sense of justice, She listened to them. She actually, at one point, uh, abandoned what was called purdah, which is the veil, and kind of staying behind a screen for modesty. It was kind of her one concession, if you will, to the Chahalgani's, you know, desire for her to, let's make sure you're a woman, you're not a man, and um, but she eventually abandoned that, and she cut her hair short, and she put on sort of, I don't want to say male clothing, but comfortable clothing, right? And went out into among the people and listened to them. So that's why one of the reasons that she was beloved by the people of Delhi. Another was she was, like her father, a supporter of education, the arts. It was a wonderful environment in which poetry and literature and art and philosophy, education was highly valued, and so it was a rich environment. And if you contrast that with Firuz, who took all the state resources and poured them out of a liquor bottle, you can see why the people in Delhi said, "All right, enough is enough."
That does remind me of one of the stories you highlight in the book, which is of Razia's stepbrother parading around on an elephant through the marketplace and then essentially throwing coins at anyone who was trampled in his wake. But just to once again to highlight the ways in which Razia was different, and not just different from her brothers, but different in a historical sense. This whole time we've been talking about her, we've been saying Razia Sultan, which is the masculine title, not the feminine Sultana. And I wanna ask you, why is that? Why did she choose to go by Sultan and not Sultana?
Well, I think it's because she didn't. Sultana means like an assistant, like a sidekick, somebody who is secondary. And she was quite clear that she was not secondary. She was the Sultan, and she wanted to make that absolutely clear. And I believe it's in the coinage uh, of the time. And she also had, whatever government business was going on, it was done by her, Razia Sultan, and so she was just smart, she was just smart, and she reacted under pressure in a great way. There were riots at one point. There was always political strife in the Muslim world, in the Christian world, everywhere, right? I mean, there's usually religious strife of one stripe or another. And during one particular riot, when everybody was going nuts, she calmed the situation down. I mean, she did it by calling in soldiers. Okay, that needed to be done. But she quickly got the business back up and running, the market back up and running. And look at what happens today, right? When politicians, I mean, when Donald Trump says something, right, crazy, and all of a sudden the market starts to tank, and that needs to be addressed. And when the market kind of corrects itself a bit, I mean, people feel a little bit better. I mean, I don't know how good anyone can feel about Donald Trump, but at least she understood that when business is good, when business is business, then everybody's going to be okay. All right, things are going to be fine. So she was able to think quickly in situations. She went on military campaigns. If people were getting out of line in the far reaches of the empire, she, got on a horse and rode at the head of an army and addressed it. But she and a lot of other of the women in the book, they did engage in military campaigns, but they were less violent than a lot of the men. They much preferred to show up and say, "Look, let's talk about this. Let's negotiate this. Um, you can see that I have this army behind me, right? And so, you don't have a chance. Let's talk about it and figure out how to get things back online." And so, a lot of women in the book did that, and and sometimes they paid off an enemy. Uh, that's okay. Rather than have they didn't want to see a lot of people die. Frankly, blood is expensive, And it also, when you storm fortresses and tear down cities and buildings, that's just a waste. And so a lot of the women in the book were better at just saying, let's talk about things and try and work it out. And I don't know. I think women in general, I think studies have shown women in general are a lot better at talking about things. Men usually punch each other in the nose first and then work try and work it out, you know. So anyway, I hope I'm not getting too stereotypical here, but
No, it's all good. So we've talked about Razia's rise to power. She spent around 3 years ruling, and then unfortunately, things went very quickly downhill. Could you walk us through how Razia Sultan, the reign of the first and only woman sultan of the Delhi Sultanate, ended?
sure. I mean, as much as I just pointed out that she was good at negotiating military campaigns, some of them were not successful. You know, she lost a couple of cities that were important. Um, there were a, there's a group of Hindu military elites that were always kind of pushing against the borders of the Sultanate of Delhi, and they were a constant worry. And so she did lose out a bit there, which made people unhappy. She also took some very daring moves. For instance, she wanted to uh, abolish this tax on non-Muslim residents of the empire, and the Chavalgani said, "Well, what are you talking about? You know, that's money. That's money in our pockets. What's wrong with you? You can't do that." But she was, you know, she was compassionate, uh, and so that things like that began to rub these guys the wrong way. But really, at the heart of it all, she threatened their power, as happens with any political administration or what have you. When there's a threat to the leader's power, then there can be unfortunate results. And so the Chahalgani got some kind of, you know, bohunk guy out in the provinces to lead a revolt, and he started a revolt, and she had to go out and address that, and she was captured. That campaign was unsuccessful. But, you know, as I put in the book, like in a trend of events that you'd have to be a soap opera writer to concoct, right? He puts her in jail and then they fall in love. And so, I think that part of that is legend, but I think it underscores that, okay, this guy said, well, you know what? Maybe I can run the empire if I just marry her, right? And by the way, the fact that he wanted to marry her and was willing to marry her was strong evidence against her ever having had any kind of sexual affair with somebody else, because he never would have married her if she hadn't been a virgin, and you know, it wouldn't have been done. So they banded together and marched on Delhi, and unfortunately, they lost, and she ended up rather ignobly in a farmer's field, having run from not run from the battle, but you know, it was a battle, and she lost, and so she was exhausted, and she ended up kind of under a tree, and a peasant saw her and noted that she had some jeweled garments underneath her chainmail, you know, her armor, if you will, and said, "Hmm, I took those," and he went into town and he tried to sell them, and you know, he was kind of a moron in a way, because how often does a farmer come up with like a jeweled garment? Oh, look, you know, this just happened. I just happened to find this in my attic. I mean, no. So the local police authorities said, "Mm-mm, something's wrong here," and they found out that she indeed was where she was, and so that ended her days. It was unfortunate because she really was, you know, did a lot to help the Sultanate um, maintain its power, become a respected power, and her successor is another one of their half brothers, was a noted, you know, was about as bad as Firuz was. You know, things went south, and eventually the Delhi, the Sultanate of Delhi, if you look at it on a map, I mean, it went from northern India at times all the way down to southern India. It was massive. Uh, but eventually it kind of got swallowed up. And I'm not going to talk too much about the modern history, which is tragic and sad in many, many ways. I mean, Pakistan is up there and, you know,
It is a definitely a tragic fairy tale ending to a queen who rose to power against all odds, but her legacy does survive till this day, and if we jump ahead 3 centuries, there's another queen whose legacy also continues to inspire till this day. So again, jumping ahead, give or take 3 or 4 centuries, let's talk about the second Indian Muslim queen featured in this book, Nur Jahan, the wife of Mughal Emperor Jahangir. Like Razia Sultan, she was born to a powerful family, but unlike Razia Sultan, she had a much longer journey coming to that power. Can you walk us through how Nur Jahan came to be wed to Emperor Jahangir, son of Akbar the Great?
yes, this is another kind of romantic story in a way. She was the daughter of a Safavid, a Persian administrator who fled Persia because of a kind of a maniacal rule of a guy named the Sultan Ismail, who was the Sultan of the Safavid Empire up in Persia, and he was kind of a paranoid man who saw enemies everywhere he looked, and he's featured in another chapter in the book. His sister was Pari Khan Khanum, another ruler, but in any event, her father Gias left the empire with his wife and children, and his wife was immensely pregnant at the time, and they traveled from Persia to India, and to do so, it was a rough journey, over mountains and through deserts and very dangerous passes, and so, they joined a caravan, and she or the his mo her mother gave birth to her in what is now Afghanistan, and, they got robbed, of course, and they had nothing left to them, and uh, at one point, again, this is kind of apocryphal. I mean, a lot of these stories are sort of like George Washington throwing a silver dollar across the Potomac or chopping down the cherry tree, but these are the stories anyway. And at one point, because they were robbed and had nothing left, they left her by the side of the road, which was a horrible thing to do, right? A mother could barely accept that, but they had to. And the mother was so bereft that the father finally went back to find her. Um, and there was supposed to be a snake wrapped around her, and he scared the snake away, and she lived. Another story, another version of the story is that the the caravan merchant, the guy who director of the caravan, found her and realized that she needed a wet nurse and gave her back to her mother without even knowing that her mother was her mother. Um, so they're a wonderful story. I mean, there's a story about a comet that streaked across the sky near the time of her birth. So these things are retrospective, and I think they're based upon the fact that she was this very impressive woman. Now, how did she get that way? Well, when they finally got uh, uh, to the Mughal court, her father got a job, if you will, as a civil servant. Kind of rose through the ranks and did very well, became very wealthy. He was very capable, and so she grew up having what, you might consider to be kind of a privileged background, right? I mean, imagine some, girl today being sent off to prep school and, coming home and not really having to worry about too much and then having a husband kind of chosen for her. I mean, the girls back then, by the time they hit puberty, it was about time to start looking around for a husband for them. So her father found her a husband, a guy named Ali Cooley, who was kind of a macho guy, a warrior. He served with Jahangir's birth name was Salam. Jahangir was his name, his royal name. Uh, but he served Salam on campaign, and Salam rewarded him with the name of the Tiger Slayer, kind of an honorific, if you will. And so she married him, and they went off to the provinces together. but she was very astute at kind of observing the way government works. She sort of heard things secondhand through her father, correspondence with her father, through listening to Ali Kuli, because his job was to collect taxes and to kind of administer that part of the empire, which, by the way, was an enormous, wealthy empire. The Mughal Empire, think of it what you will, at it during its height, it was responsible for about a quarter of the world's GDP. I mean, it was the largest economy and manufacturing power in the world in its heyday, in the 16th century and in the 17th century, and, before the British came and decided to, looked at it like a Russian wolf eyeing a peasant, right? I mean, it's like, "Oh, this looks good." And they kinda took over, and, the rest is unfortunately sad history. But, in any event, so she paid attention to what was going on, and, but there were, of course, always shifts at court. Um Shifts between, political struggles, and Solomon was in favor, and then he wasn't in favor, and then his father got a little nervous, and, um, he had some real addiction problems, Solomon, Jahangir. That was really his downfall, was addiction. I mean, he was addicted to alcohol, he was addicted to drugs, and his father thought, "Well, I don't know, this guy's not gonna work out. Maybe I should appoint my grandson, his son, to succeed," and there was tensions there. Um, and so Ali Kuli, Nur Jahan's, husband, kind of put up his finger to the wind to decide which way are we gonna go here and who's gonna win, who's gonna lose, and unfortunately, he decided to not betray, but shift his alliances from Solomon. And so he sent his troops to go and arrest him, basically, and, he fought them, and he died. And so now Nur Jahan, which by the name wasn't her birth name was, Mirror Nisa, which is the sun, like the sunlight of women. Nur Jahan was her royal name that she adopted later, or was given to her by her husband. Um, but in any event, now she is a widow, and she had one daughter, one child, and it was the custom to, if you were, if you were a person who was defeated in battle, you were treated, your family was treated well. They weren't just slaughtered, they had respect. And so you would be taken in and treated well, become a member of the household. And so that's what happened to her. And she came back and was, put into the harem, which is, I take great pains to discuss the harem in the book, to disabuse people of the thought of a harem as being kind of like this lascivious place where women are lying around semi-naked, just waiting, for the sultan to show up. I mean, it was really more of a, believe it or not, it was really more like a women's college. I mean, it was a place where they studied, they learned poetry, they learned art, they learned dancing, they learned painting, they studied philosophy and science, they ran businesses, all this stuff. It was just where the women lived. It was the women's quarters. And the segregation of women and men has long been something that's gone on, not only in Islamic culture, but in Christian culture and in ancient Greece and Rome. I mean, so it's not, you can't look upon it as being this chauvinistic, enterprise. It's something that was very normal for centuries. So anyway, she lived in the harem and ultimately was noticed by Solomon, who said, wow, she's very lovely and vivacious and intelligent. And, uh, she had been, as I say, she had been given a wonderful education. So, although it was late in life that she ended up, marrying for the second time. She was 35, I think, and, her husband was, 41, so a little bit, so a kind of a autumn marriage, if you will. And,
How Nur Jahan became this de facto ruler of the Mughal Empire. You quote a number of chroniclers from the time period, whether they be European or from within the court itself, who all say the same thing, that while Jahangir was king in name, it was Nur Jahan who effectively ruled his kingdom. So what did that look like?
Okay, that's a really, it was kind of a mixed bag, and by that I mean she one of the reasons I admire her so much was because she was both a hard-nosed administrator and she was a compassionate wife. Her husband was a drug addict and an alcoholic, and she loved him. And for anybody who has ever had a spouse, a family member, somebody who has suffered from addiction, mental illness, any of these things, uh, you know, and stood by them. Uh, it's very moving and touching, and it's not just because, well, if I'm not married to him, then that's it. My political career is over. I'll be cast out on the street or whatever. That was I don't think that was her motivation. I think she loved him and genuinely cared about him. Uh, and so that was one side of her. The other side of her was she was sharp as a tack, and she had great business acumen. She had her own fleet of ships, merchant ships, that made her a lot of money and helped also. But she didn't keep it for herself. She used it in philanthropic ways, by helping young girls, poor girls, um, in the empire. She, gave dowries away to those who couldn't. She designed clothing, a special set of clothing for young newlyweds. She designed her own line of clothing. She designed her own perfume. She designed buildings. She gave input on architectural, endeavors, and she was really kind of Martha Stewart may not be a good, so I don't know if your listeners will know Martha Stewart now, but she was kind of the Martha Stewart of her day. I mean, she had great taste. Let's put it that way. All right, she had terrific taste and sensibilities. Um, but also, what's very important to know is that she it was clear to the people who were coming to the throne, um, hat in hand, that she was in charge, and things were issued in her name, not as wife of Jahangir. It was issued in her name, and there are reports from many of the kind of ambassadors or representatives of the Dutch East India Company, the English East India Company, that talked about how if you want something done, you have to go see her. That's it. You're not gonna get anything done unless you negotiate with her. And now you could accuse her of nepotism. I mean, once she got in charge, all of a sudden her mother was raised in position and her brother's an important figure at court, and, you know, but hey, is that unusual? Not really. I mean, this happens throughout history, throughout look at the Trump White House. I mean, I'm not comparing her to the Trump White House, but what I mean is it's not unusual and it's not unheard of. And what's interesting is also these some of these envoys write about how it's just you got to go and you got to show up with a gift of some kind. And I think that also kind of underscores what for a lot of maybe Western people are not accustomed to is that in a great part of the world, you bring a gift. I mean, it was a bribe. Yeah, okay, sure, it was a bribe to butter her up, but it's also just cultural. You don't show up empty-handed at someone's home, basically, and they have something for you. It's just different in the West, and in particular where I live in New England. We're all kind of Protestant and stiff, and we, and inflexible in our behavior. But, so anyway,
Actually, there's one final question on Nur Jahan, and that unfortunately has to do with the way her reign ended. it wasn't as tragic as Razia Sultan, but still she didn't live out her days in a palace, did she? How did Nur Jahan's reign come to an end?
Well, when her husband died, there was a succession debate, and her, I guess it would be her stepson, um, you know, came in and took over. And she didn't put up a huge battle about. I mean, there was a battle. She lost, but she didn't um, go around now trying to be. She wasn't a rebel. She accepted her fate and spent out kind of the latter. I don't know how many decades of her life. She lived pretty, a respectable age. Um, and she just lived a quiet life. She had a lot of money, but again, she donated it to a lot of people, poor people. She had real compassion. That was the thing, and so you get that sense in the way that she behaved, not only towards her husband, but towards the way she behaved towards the people. And so I think that's one thing that's really quite admirable about her. But her, like I say, her business sense was pretty impressive. And she also, oh, she was very creative. Like I said, she designed gardens too. There was an account written by an ambassador who was just gobsmacked by some of the gardens. Like there was a waterfall that had lanterns behind it, colored lanterns. I mean, you can imagine this. Like that'd be impressive even today, right? There'd just be lights maybe, but these were lanterns behind a waterfall in a garden that illuminated the thing from behind. I mean, and the Taj Mahal, which was designed after, but uh, that is in sort of in line with the kind of artistic vision that she had. Her parents' tombs, I believe, are right across the way, and so uh, but she ended her life quietly, not tragically, not dragged through the streets or what have you. And other queens were in the book did meet unfortunate ends. Most of them, though, were respected throughout the course of their lives and honored. And I believe that both of these women, and you correct me if I'm wrong here, in Indian culture, both of them are kind of revered. And I know that
Absolutely.
Razia, there's like TV shows and movies and probably T-shirts and lunchboxes and who the heck knows what else, right? I mean, because she's kind of a cultural hero. And I'm not surprised, and I'm not so familiar with what it's like the reverence for Nur Jahan is, but I imagine it's probably up there.
Absolutely. I think that one thing that, since you're speaking a little bit about the modern time, one thing that's kind of come to dominate discussion of just Mughals and Muslim rule in general throughout Indian history is this idea, one that is posited by the far right in India, that it was exclusively a reign of intolerance, one in which Hindus were completely on the back foot, and one in which there was no tolerance to speak of. But in your book, you highlight multiple instances of, or multiple examples of the ways in which tolerance, both religious and racial, characterized Razia and Nur Jahan's reigns. Can you speak a little bit more on how that manifested for both these women?
Sure. Well, in the case of Nur Jahan, she well, both of them actually, both of them recognize that kind of the more the merrier in a way. I mean, we can learn a lot from other cultures. It's okay. Now, certainly, uh, it was established that okay, we're not a Shia state, we are a Sunni state, and as long as you get that understood, then all right. But it's all right to bring in Hindu uh, philosophy and science. We can learn from that, and it is a Muslim tradition, as far as I am aware, to seek out knowledge. Right? I mean, don't remain in the dark. Don't close yourself in so much that you're not open to what other people have to say. So these both of these courts were places where there were a lot of different people coming and going. I mean, in Nur Jahan's case, right, you had a lot of these people coming in from Persia. They understood that there was a lot to learn from others, and so there was religious, even religious tolerance, to a degree. I mean, if you stepped out of line and rebelled, then like any rebellion, it's gonna, you're gonna get backlash. But so both of these places were. Imagine, I'm trying to think of what would be like today. Um, uh, like I imagine like New York City, right? In a way, there's just like so many different people, so many different things, so many different neighborhoods, so much to see and learn, so much culture, so much rich history. I mean, we have all these wonderful museums in New York and theater and everything else going on. So I think you can kind of imagine these places sort of like that in a way. Um, and and now we have a Muslim mayor there, right? So we'll see if he brings back some of that glory. I don't know. Not everybody's convinced of that, but I have great hopes for him. So,
They call it now Mamdanistan. I'm just
yeah,
kidding.
Afghanistan figures. Um,
But no, that's a really beautiful way of putting it, for the modern listener, which is very much so in line with what historians say about these different periods of Muslim rule in India, that they're not simply characterized by, the dominance of one group over another, but rather an intermingling of cultures and ideas and philosophies, which is something that we hope see we that's something that we hope sees a revival in India, which is unfortunately really letting go of that history of multiculturalism. But to close us out, what is it that you hope people take away from this book and from the lives of Nur Jahan and Razia Sultan?
well, following up on what you just said, I think that one of my objectives has been to help non-Muslims understand that Islam is not this monolithic thing. It's not. If you think about Christianity, right? If you go to a Christian, Southern Baptist service in West Virginia, and then you go to a high Episcopal service in Philadelphia, you're going to be seeing two entirely different, or a Greek Orthodox service in New London, Connecticut. You're going to see entirely different things, but they're all Christianity. And I think Islam, you have to look upon it in the same way. It varies, according to, first of all, what we might call denominations, I guess. But it also varies according to the culture where people grew up, and where the various where the religion took hold in various parts of the world. So if you are thinking to yourself, if you're somebody who doesn't really know too much about Islam and doesn't know too much about the role of women in Islam, you might think to yourself, well, let's look at these reports about the Taliban in Afghanistan and women walking around covered from head to toe and they cannot even speak in public and all that. Well, that is a very narrow, small piece of, I wouldn't even call it Islam. I mean, frankly, maybe I'm speaking out of turn because I'm not a Muslim, but it's for Muslims to say that's not Islam. But, it doesn't represent at all, I think, this long culture of learning and understanding and reaching out and fellowship and all the rest of it. I mean, I've been to iftars that have just been terrific. I've been welcomed there, and nobody at the door said to me, "What, are you a Muslim? Are you not?" And they just said, come on in and sit down and eat because we're celebrating, and you're welcome to do that. And it's a great place, by the way, a great opportunity, I think, for non-Muslims to go and learn a little bit. Um, the media. Look, there's a saying in the journalism business is that nobody ever writes a story about this, a plane lands safely, right? I mean, it's always what is the most extreme tragic thing that's going on. And so if you look at the Taliban, or you look at Boko Haram, or you look at even in Iran, I mean, Iran was Persia, you know. So I'm talking about this culture, hundreds of years ago in Persia. It was a lot different. It was a lot more open and cultured. And I'm not going to denounce Iran here, but I'm just saying a lot of the repression of women, I think, in the Muslim world happened in the wake of the fall and failure in the fall of colonialism, the failure of nationalism in the Muslim world. And people were dejected and despondent that it didn't work out. The West came in and installed these dictators, and it really was humiliating, I think, for a lot of people in the Muslim world. And so some people just said, well, obviously the reason that we're suffering so much is that we've turned from the Quran, we've turned from the old religion, if you will. Let's go back and do that. Of course, if you have people who don't know what they're talking about, misinterpreting, then you end up in a lot of trouble. And when those people then pick up guns and have the power of the state behind them, then it's even worse. So I may be going off track a little bit here, but another thing that I think it's just important to know is that women in the Muslim world are not universally repressed. They're not treated as second class citizens. They're not I've traveled around quite a bit, from the Arabian Peninsula across North Africa, um, and I've been to a lot of Muslim countries. And I have engaged, I've met a lot of women who are business women, who are heads of households, or who, I mean, they have a kind of, an autonomy. They're respected in the culture. Now, you know, you're wearing a hijab. I, you're wearing it. I don't know. That's your personal choice. I imagine. I don't know. It's none of my business. But I was going to say, for a lot of women in the Muslim world, if they wear a hijab, they wear it because they want to. It's because of it's their in the same way that a Christian woman might wear a cross around her neck. It's a sign of spirituality, and and you know what? It's not up to me or anybody else to say to you, well, you shouldn't be wearing that. You know, you're repressed. You make up your own mind about what you want to do. So I don't know. I think, here's one thing that happened when I was, the book was based upon a series of articles that I did for Aramco World magazine back in 2016. And when I told people I was working on this series, without fail, the first thing that came out of their mouths was, really? There were women rulers in the Muslim world? No kidding. I never heard that. And so that's one of the reasons that I wrote the book, is because I think that more people should know about it. I mean, scholars of Islamic history have heard of these women. People like yourself have heard of these women, or some of them, maybe not all of them. But so you're not my audience, although I'm happy that you enjoyed the book. And my audience are people who are just have would it never occur to them, because of what the modern media has done, how women have been represented. And this is not to say, by the way, that there is not oppression. It does exist in some of these places. Women's rights have been terribly oppressed, both in the Muslim world and outside the Muslim world. I mean, in America, we still haven't had a woman president, yet. Yet there have been women heads of state in the Muslim world, not only like in recent history, right? So why is it that we can't here in the West, you know, elect a woman president? They're in Congress, which is great, but they're still subject to abuse, and it's just shameful and unnecessary. Really, at the end of the day, though, I think that when it comes to politics and it comes to just, um, it's just women get things done. I mean, that's really it. They get stuff done. Guys sit around and just kind of, I don't know, should we do this? Should we do that? I don't know. Let's sit down and let's sit down and talk about it and play cards or whatever. I don't know. I mean, I think that, or they act irresponsibly with knee jerk reactions. I think women traditionally have just gotten stuff done. in families, in society, in communities. And I learned that over and over again by researching this book. Um, so one more thing I'll say, actually, when colonialism was an awful period, and I bracketed the historical context of this book from the early centuries of Islam up until the dawn of colonialism, when the Muslim world began to be conquered and taken over by the West. But in that arc, that like 1,000-year arc, the Muslim world was quite powerful, and there were women rulers in the Muslim world. But when our idea, the Western idea that we have of women should, be seen and not heard, or be in the home, and that's it. Produce children and take care of the house. That's it. That's their only role. That is a very Western Victorian ideal. And when Western colonialists, you know, took over the Muslim world, but especially in Africa, they came in and they saw, well, what are all these women doing? Like, you know, having a voice in the community, and what are they doing armed? And what are they? Well, how is this? This doesn't make sense to us. So they reformed society a lot, and so another legacy, another reason that women, I think, are looked upon as subservient. It's not Islamic. It is Western, and it's I'll probably get in a lot of trouble for this, but it's Western Christian, really. Um, it's not something that I have found to be true of the Muslim world, by and large, with the few exceptions that I've named.
I think that's a beautiful answer. Tom, thank you so much for your time today. To our listeners, Queens of Islam, the Muslim World's Historic Women Rulers, is available for purchase on interlinkbooks.com. You've been listening to Beyond the Taj, a podcast brought to you by the Indian American Muslim Council. Thank you for tuning in for this month's episode, and we'll see you next time as we continue on our journey to go past the stereotypes and the monuments and explore the heart of who we are.